Welcome to the Build and Deploy track. Today is day 2. Just for your reminder, sessions today will be recorded and available for later viewing. So our next guest, I'm really excited to welcome to the stage. He's created and built experimentation platforms at companies such as Orbitz, Expedia, Raise. He's currently the experimentation and UI engineering team lead at Vivid Seats. He's a startup founder and the author of Building Responsive Data Visualizations for the Web. Please welcome Bill Hinderman.
Thanks, man. Good morning. Microphone on? Yeah. Welcome to the hangover slot. Y'all made it. As mentioned, I'm Bill. I'm the web and experimentation team lead at Vivid Seats. What does that mean? Well, I manage our web team. I lead our experimentation, both practice and platform. And really, my team builds the tools and defines the proper methodologies for experiment creation and implementation. Vivid Seats, just to give sort of context, we experiment across our website, our apps, our partner sites. We're using full stack. We've been using full stack for about a year now. And if the weekly usage reports are to be believed, we'll hit just about 300 million impressions when we hit that year mark. So we experiment a lot. We experiment on a lot of things. So my job is probably similar to a lot of yours out here. So why specifically am I up here? Well, I've built these teams at Vivid Seats, at Raise, at Expedia, and at Orbitz, and so I find myself with sort of the unique pedigree of having screwed this up at a lot of different places. So I want to start with the story of doing that. This spring, my team was running an experiment to move to a new design of our tickets page at Vivid Seats. And what does that mean? Got to look at this screen. Tickets page is sort of this part in the funnel where you're actually deciding what you want to buy, right? You're looking at a venue, you're picking the thing you're going to spend money on. So you're here, you pick a ticket, you check out. And there's either the direct way to get there, or more accurately, there's a lot of ways to get there, right? There's direct, there's organic search, there's paid search, there's ad placements, there's email. And so this is sort of the pivotal point in our funnel where no one can skip this. And that means 3 things for us. It means, number 1, we get a lot of users through it. So it's terrific for experimentation volume, right? We can get users through this page and get significance rather quickly. We have a lot of appetite to modify it for that same reason, because we anticipate any changes here to make a big, big impact on all of our users. And also, we're absolutely terrified of changing anything on this page, because if we break something, there's no other path, and we break everything. So we did that. This page, right, it's our piggy bank. And so I want to run through the timeline of this test that we ran. About a year ago, we had still non-responsive versions of this page. So we had a desktop version, a mobile version, and at the time, I think we relied on 100,000 different JavaScript libraries to render that whole page. So in January, we rolled out a React version of the page on desktop, right? We cleaned it up. We did a full tech restructuring of the page, and it was successful, right? It was largely an AA, but it did see a slight impact because the performance was a lot better. In May, we began a responsive version of this page, and what we did was we essentially forked the React version and fiddled with it to make it work desktop and mobile. In June, we turned that responsive version on both on desktop and on mobile. So desktop was essentially an AA, whereas mobile was an AB of the old design versus the new one. And as expected, desktop was no impact because it was an AA and we used our tools correctly. And mobile, we couldn't get to beat the control. We couldn't get this to beat our sort of legacy version of the page. So we tried a few different things. We modified the test a bit. And early July, we still couldn't figure it out. But we knew we were eventually going to productionalize this somewhere. So we turned off the test on mobile. We began to impact code in both the control and the test versions of desktop and start to roll that out, assuming we're eventually going to turn this on. So we turned off the whole test because we didn't want to just roll out desktop while waiting on mobile. And 2 weeks after we turned off the test, I got a message that Internet Explorer conversion looked a little off. And so I said, well, yeah, it does that. It's Internet Explorer. But it turned out that anyone going to that tickets page, that page that you have to go to buy anything on Internet Explorer 10 and 11, they saw that version of the page, which it's a bold redesign. So I panicked a little bit, and I started to dig into the data, and I found that we had not had a single conversion in IE 10 or 11 for 2 weeks. So I was talking to our VP of product, And I said, fudge. And I panicked and I got scared, and then I realized that we can solve this, right? This was an opportunity to take the lessons of the teams I'd built over the years that had sort of known this was good practice, but we could clearly get sloppy with, and make good testing practice here mandatory and operationalized at scale. So right today, I want to talk about building a practice that doesn't go wrong, but if it does, learns when it does. And I'm going to start that by sort of going through my personal experimentation journey from siloed teams to managing efforts across these organizations. So just to go in brief today, if these are questions that maybe you have, what keeps your organization from scaling up experimentation? How can you address those issues with technology, with processes? And how do you validate experiments at large and small scale with a high-performing experimentation process that can hopefully help you if you're at a large organization, but will still be impactful if you're somewhere smaller? I'll also give you sort of a rubric for a good experiment hypothesis, one that can make a quantifiable change. I know good is sort of a bad word for this, but one that is at least measurable. And then how to sanely integrate full stack testing within your organization, both technologically and process-wise for your product and engineering teams. Right, ultimately, you'll get to a repeatable experimentation process once you have this technology in place, once you've built a center of excellence, and let that mindset of experimentation blossom and grow into hopefully all of your organization. So right, maybe this is your engineering team right now. A lot of people heads down just working on the only thing they know how to do. So I kind of can't see, but who has an experimentation team in this room? Okay. Who has more of a decentralized effort? Okay, a little more of that. What about like an internal consultancy where the team kind of owns part of it and they go to other teams? Okay, a couple of you. That's the right answer, just so you know. Right, I think getting to the point where you reach a spot where experimentation as its own product is really valuable, and we'll get there, I promise. But how did I start? Well, I ran a test here. This was our desktop hotel search cards at Orbitz probably 5 years ago, and my experimentation journey started here. We had siloed sort of product vertical slice teams, and I was within a hotel, and I just got chummy with our head of experimentation, and we had built sort of a deep stack multivariate testing tool, and we were using Adobe Test and Target at the time to run very lightweight client-side experiments. We wanted to find a way to sort of bridge that, so we did that. And it was incredibly successful. We had this appetite for testing just from starting to modify copy, right? This is a classic test, but it still makes a difference. And I think the difference here was we found that our technology was not being utilized in a way that it could be. And we started to use that to build this political momentum in the organization to not just do testing within individual teams, but to build out a team that sort of at the beginning of our journey owned this experimentation mindset, owned this experimentation technology. Right, and if you're lucky enough to be part of that team, you're going to have to do that because you're going to have to convince every other team that you can play in their space. You're going to have to teach them a new way to build things, and maybe that the way they're building things right now isn't great. And you're going to have to defend like a 10 to 15% hit rate. That's really hard. So I think you need to be able to push others, to ask tough questions, to ask why you haven't tried things, and be an analytical, self-driven expert, and maybe more important than actually being an expert, being recognized as an expert at your own organization. So how do you do that? Well, I think you've got to build a roadmap based off of learning, right? And I think that's sort of the mindset of every talk that we have here, but we're going to focus more on this first one, which is picking tools as your first step. Shifting the organization that isn't used to testing starts with getting your technology in a good spot, in a spot that it's not the barrier to your experimentation journey at scale. Anybody know what this is? Take a guess. Penicillin. Anybody know the story about penicillin? I'm going to tell it anyway. So, Alexander Fleming was studying Staphylococcus, and he added a bunch of bacteria to a petri dish before leaving for a vacation. And he expected the bacteria to grow, but instead he found a bunch of mold growing. He found penicillin. And that was a mistake, right? He found this really important, really world-changing discovery as a byproduct of just an accident. And I think another way to look at this is that you'll fail, and it'll be the best thing that ever happens to your team. What do I mean by that? Well, right, as you're picking these tools, I'm going to leave this up for as long as I can. When you're picking these tools, when you're starting this organization, you don't want your goal of the experimentation team to just be risk mitigation, but it's one hell of a fringe benefit, right? You're here, this is a good sign, you're working on this journey, but I think when you're starting to build with these tools, you've got to realize that just making more money is terrific, but every time that you don't lose money is also great. Because, right, if you're large enough, these two things mean very different things. Our Internet Explorer traffic is maybe 3%, so relatively, we didn't notice this issue with our first this experiment we mentioned for a full 2 weeks. Now, actual impact, it was a number with 2 commas in it. The absolute number is massive. So I think even small tests, whether they mitigate loss, whether they actually improve the business, they can act as a door wedge because the absolute impact pretty much pays for your team for the year immediately. And at scale, even when the relative number is relatively low, the absolute number will always be very big. And if you can capitalize on that immediately, that's great. You can celebrate it. If you lose, you can also capitalize that. And you can show the team that here's what we would have lost if we just rolled this out. We now have all of this information about how it works, and we can celebrate how much we didn't lose. So what tools do you actually pick? Well, we use Optimizely. We use full stack. And I think what's important to that is finding tools that empower your team to test in a way that isn't broken in comparison to the rest of your processes. By which I mean, wire your own experimentation tools into the processes you already have. There was a lot of talk about this at Developer Night last night with some of the opportunistic pieces of code that have been written around the SDK that I think we'll talk about a bit too. So I want to talk about one thing that actually Optimizely built as well, and I built. But this is the biggest thing that we built into our Optimizely full stack build out, and that's just query params. What is this? This is a way for our users, our QA users especially, to force themselves into tests. And so what is this? We have a layer of abstraction that allows us to skip our call to Optimizely to begin with. Our own service internally will look for whatever the experiment key is in the URL, and if it finds it, skip all of our calls to Optimizely full stack and just force you into a recipe, cookie that, and save it. It helps us with our QA cycle because people don't have to wait to cookie themselves into a recipe. It also helps us share recipes with our stakeholders. It helps us share this information, share that we're doing these experiments, and explain in demos, in stakeholder meetings why we're doing it. It really lets us debug in like a second, and it's built into our own tools. So just really quickly what it looks like. Do I have the, I do. When we're grabbing a variation, we grab the key, we save it. If it's null, we put it into a cookie, so you don't have to keep that in the URL. And then we just return it. It's really straightforward. We skip all of our other calls, and it speeds up our integration. Right? It's a technical solution to empowering our teams to experiment more efficiently, and it evolved out of Blackboxing, part of our experimentation program. I'll get to that in a second. I think that the part of building out these tools is aligning them with your development environments. So make sure that whatever testing environments you have, be it your project settings, be it multiple projects, make sure those stay in sync with your development cycle, and automate that sync if you can. Right? There's a lot of great APIs within full stack. What do I mean by that? Well, here's a test in our production environment that has also production and stage. Right? You see right here, we have 2 different environments for production. This is great. If you're anybody using full stack and using these environments, cool, yeah, you. That doesn't fit our cycle. Just the way that we run tests, we try to keep staging and production always in sync. So we'd be pushing additional data from staging into our tests. So we just used it differently. We just made a production project and a staging project. And this fits for us, right? We didn't try to force our process into the testing toolset. We used the testing toolset to aid our process. So I know I said there was starting and there was ending, but there's this middle step. I lied. What's the tipping point when you're sort of done starting and you're hitting a plateau? What's the difference between creating a team and growing a team? Maybe you've picked great tools, maybe you have a small team or a virtual team of experimentation experts within your organization, but you've still sort of got this niche center of excellence rather than one that is either artificially given these tools and the ones who are told they own it, or the ones that have been recognized at this point as optimization leaders. Right? I think they own stuff, but they're not knowing how to move on to the next step. And before I move on, if you get to this point, you've still come a long way, right? You're still an organization that is using testing, is operating a lot more efficiently, and is capitalizing on analytics and insights-driven product development. But there's other stuff you can do. So thing number one is deciding upon what team structure works for you at scale. And there's three of these, right? We talked about them. I forced you guys to raise your hands a few minutes ago. There's one where one team does the testing. There's one where all teams do the testing. There's one that I like to think of as a testing consultancy. So what does this look like? Well, it's called yellow experimentation and black all the other product stuff. If you have this sort of team, right, you have this team that is empowered and is maybe forced from their organizational thesis to just do all the testing. And that's fine, right? The pro is they will become experts. The con is that they will be the only experts. So you don't have another team that can sort of play in the space, can capitalize on learning. So a lot of these other teams will ultimately be led or dictated to by the results of this team's tests. So there's sort of a lack of ownership, I feel like, in the teams in the gray-black color. Another option is this team starts to own a little more of the platform, right, the testing tools internally, and then all the other teams happen to do some testing. This is great because you can decentralize this learning, right? You can get a lot of teams to understand testing. The downside is that no one person will be responsible for it. So your platform, your testing platform may suffer a bit because you ultimately won't have any one team that owns it and will evolve it. You'll sort of just get what's given to you. And teams will use testing in very different ways, right? There won't be one standard way across your organization to handle experimentation. The third way, the way that I think is really cool, is start to split this team up. So you have an experimentation team. You have them become the experts. You have them build this platform for a while. And then you decentralize them. You move them into other teams. You have them teach and work with all the other teams to learn on their own, to empower those teams to do their own testing, but have your team available and have them not focused purely on their own roadmap, their own experimentation across the organization, but have individuals from this team work specifically within, in this case, the search vertical, the app vertical, the checkout vertical, and have experts within this testing team work on both testing for other teams and evolving your tool set. So I mentioned this a minute ago. I think this is the next step in growing to a more scalable testing practice, and that's blackboxing your testing engine. Right, that's, if we go back one slide, that was the part of this testing team that is their owned product. It's turning experimentation into a product that's just as important as checkout, as your app. So how we did it, that's what the code looks like, is that we built our own service around all of our wrappers, our own service around the Optimizely SDK in both Java and in JavaScript. So I mentioned before, we test on web, we test on our partner websites, we test on our apps. And so we needed one centralized way to do that. So I'm lying, we actually have a couple of them because we touch them in different apps. But they're all just essentially copies of each other. If we push them down into their own core repo, they could be one. And this technique pretty much just looks like that. We have a testable, cacheable, scalable way to modify this. And we don't integrate directly into the SDK. This is what's important to me, is that our testing, although we use Optimizely, and it's fantastic, it's not reliant on Optimizely. If we needed to suddenly swap out to a different partner, to building our own tools because somebody got a wild hair that they wanted to do that, we could swap it in 1 second. Part of the integration looks like this. We can get a variation. Internally, we check if it's a customer, so we're able to save on impressions by not sending any non-customer requests to Optimizely. We can do things like send all of our base attributes in every call. Those look like this. This is, right, by blackboxing experimentation, We don't have to individually send browser type and version and channel and device type and platform every time. We just automatically have it. We have that force parameter that I showed before. This is part of this building out this black box. And then we have an ability to cache and save the way we want to handle UUIDs and how to save sessions for individuals within our web app versus longer living Optimizely sessions. Let me skip a couple of those because they're the same thing. So this is what it looks like, right? We have these black boxes that allow us to hit this full stack client across all of our different apps. And obviously we want to get to here, right? This is the ultimate, but we've still come to this way where we can treat testing as a service, as a product that can fail, can be versioned, can be updated, can be modified without any other team knowing. And I think this is a lesson learned from Orbitz, is that even if it's really nice to work with now, you never want to tie your testing platform to the rest of your code because you don't want to tie anyone else's code to the rest of your code. So after this, how do you grow? Well, I think the problem you start to get to at this spot, if you've got a well-functioning team that owns their testing, that has their own platform internally, is maybe one of these two things. Your appetite has been satiated, or you've sort of reached the amount of testing that you feel like you can do with the users you have. And I think these are symptoms of something else. Maybe it's a lack of resources, a lack of insight, a reliance on manual processes, and maybe the person testing is likely not having their ideas heard, or they're not being positioned to get more involved. Maybe you just don't have more teams to work on testing. Well, I think you can combine the answers for these. Number one, not having an appetite. Maybe you're not hitting a high enough success rate. Maybe you're not focusing on parts of the business that individual stakeholders care about. Well, I think you can start focusing on improving your hit rate within those more important parts of your business, right? If someone doesn't like how much testing you're doing, it likely means you're just not testing the right things, and you can change your focus. You can optimize the function of your team to pivot your testing platform to work within parts of the business that non-engineering and product, right, capital B business, want to change. I think you can do that by making a quantifiable, able to roll out, meaningful to customers test. So what does good mean? It means quantifiable. And so I have this really easy to remember mnemonic. It's a MIV-MERC. And it's how you, in my mind, create a repeatable testing process. So let's say we have this example. We have a test whose hypothesis is adding a ticket detail screen between the tickets list and checkout screen, which will aid users to find a more desirable ticket, which will ultimately improve conversion. And this example works for all of them because I made it on purpose. What does this look like? Here is our tickets page. If you click buy in control, you would just go to checkout. We're instead adding this sort of step in between. It would look like that on a mobile screen. So number one, M, measurable. We can measure this, right? We are saying we're going to improve conversion. This hypothesis has something that we will say is good or bad. Opposite would be enjoying their event more, right? We could not measure that. Is it visible? We're adding a new screen on a mandatory page. This is absolutely a high traffic page, and everyone will see this. Opposite, adding a link in the post-checkout receipt email. Nobody would really see that. That wouldn't affect conversion. Is this a meaningful test? Well, we're trying to get people to find a more desirable ticket, right? That should be the core of our business. We're trying to get people to buy more tickets. Opposite, view the venue's code of conduct. We probably don't care about that. Our users probably don't care about that. This isn't a test that would make a difference. Is this realistic? By which I mean, if this test were to succeed, would we ever be able to roll it out to 100% of traffic? So in this case, we have the data already. We're just adding a new module that displays that data in a different way. So it's absolutely realistic. There's no negative impact to the business. Whereas if we just gave away free tickets, that would absolutely improve conversion, but we'd never be able to roll that out. And then finally, is it cheap? By which I mean, is it cheaper to experiment with this than to roll it out and lose to begin with? And that's almost always yes, right? We're just adding this ticket detail screen. We'd have to do the work to experiment on it anyway. But let's say the opposite would be like we're building an entire details app that we don't know if it'll work. That's probably not a great thing to test because if it doesn't work, we've, number one, built it. We've also have to, number two, build the entire ecosystem to test it. All right, so these are the 5 criteria for how we decide if a change is potentially quantifiable, can make an impact, and if it should be done. So what about the other challenge here? What if you don't have the bandwidth for more experimentation? Well, it might be that you don't have the teams to support more testing and more feature work and more enhancements, and you should be combining those. But I think more meaningfully, you can refocus a small dedicated team on making testing a seamless part of the development process. And this is a hot space. Maybe you can hire for it, but more importantly, you can ease reliance on manual analytics and start to have this team improve your tools to empower more efficient bandwidth. Right? You've got to move from this one guy doing all the testing and moving everything around to a lot of teams able to work on a testing tool that does most of the manual work for you. And what I mean by that is building a hyper-analytical platform, a platform that records everything and just yells at you about it. So how we've done that is we've attached every key conversion event, by which I mean more than just buying things. Every step in our funnel sends information to Optimizely, sends it to GA, sends it to every analytics tool that we need. And I showed before, we send all of our user agent information across every single event that we send. So whenever we're saying that someone happened to get to the first step of checkout, we're also saying that they're on a specific device. They've got certain window navigator enhancements installed, and that they have a certain amount of performant JavaScript that we know how long it took to load the page. Basically, we want to get your platform to a state where it's a crazy person muttering about every single thing that happens to it. What this looks like in Optimizely is that we have this idea of these global events that happen to come out of one test, but we realized we needed them for each other test. Opposite would be for an individual test. If we have something that isn't going to exist outside of that individual test, we namespace it with what happens to be the Jira code. And we make sure to get rid of it when it's done, so it's not cluttering up our Optimizely backend. Similarly to user agent attributes, we have everything that we're sending across now, right? Browser type, browser version, channel, cookies enabled. Those are things that probably work for everybody. But specifically for us, the thing that matters is days to event, right? We want to know what our band is for how far out from an event people are. Finally, I want to talk about how to get QA involved so they don't absolutely hate your team. Because you're nonstop making their job way harder by having a lot more versions of production out there. The first thing we did for that was that query param that I showed you before. That fundamentally changed how we QA'd experiments. Or they're different from normal feature work. They have to be treated differently. And by that, I mean QA process, standard tapping in production, and also how to automate QA of tests. So let's go back to the beginning. This is pink because it's related to that individual test that screwed everything up. We got sloppy. Everything bold here is different tests that were affecting the same page because we rolled out that React version in January but didn't clean it up. And then we rolled out responsive desktop in the beginning of June and responsive mobile in the middle of June, and then another version of responsive mobile in the end of June, then another version of that in the beginning of July, and then we turned it all off and left all that code there. And we broke everything, right? 3 rounds of tests, 5 rounds of individual tests, and nothing removed. Customers didn't see the change, but we started to feel the pressure, and QA started to feel the pressure of having to change every single version of this test. It was totally perfect technology, but really bad practices. So now we have a QA process that we mandate for every experiment, and not just one experiment, but how to layer experiments on top of each other. Right, so we ideate, as you'd expect. We build this individual test. We run it, and we basically sort of lock that piece of functionality for a bit so that nothing else can be tested there. We disable it when we've gotten to significance. We analyze it. And at this point, if we're going to roll it out, this is when we decide to add automated testing. We don't have automated testing around our test experiences because we anticipate that a lot of them will lose. And although this is dangerous, what this allows us to do is as soon as we have a baseline, we know that that will have automated testing around it. And if anything goes wrong, we can assume it's not, hopefully, in the baseline and turn tests off, modify what we need to, and turn them back on. Right, how this layers with another test is ideation for the next step comes with the analysis of the first one. We build at the same time that we're rolling out and regressing and cleaning up the previous one, and then we can run it again. So let's end on this sort of idea of empowering and trusting your center of excellence. This was a big topic yesterday, last year, especially at OptiCon 17. But have this team that focuses on and delivers value as a testing platform. Have a starting goal of maybe X tests per sprint, but start to evolve that into what? Well, into one team recognized as owning the platform, maybe artificially at the start because they're the ones who are given this as their product thesis for their team. But ultimately, that makes them into the experts, right? Politically, that makes them the people come to answer testing questions. And that empowers all teams to start to experiment within their own backlog, but have this organic center of excellence of really smart people that know how to handle this, that the rest of your organization will come to and will trust, whether they've got a lot of successes or a lot of failures that they just made look like successes. Right? Because going back to this was a happy accident. Right? I didn't know that I was going to change my entire career and fundamentally how we rolled out any sort of product work at Orbitz, but I did. We went from having no testing team, having a little bit of testing, to having a team of 4 product analysts, 4 engineers, 3 data scientists, and a director of optimization, not including all of the people we then had dispersed into the product teams at Orbitz. We really fundamentally changed how we did this, and it took both good technology and good processes. Because once again, you're going to make these changes. You're going to make this introduction of a lot of different code, a lot of different ways to think about that code, and it's not for the faint of heart. Right? You've got to build this mindset. You've got to build this tool set. You've got to think big. You've got to be bold. You've got to let data drive your product. But it was mentioned yesterday, you've got to look the part. Right? You've got to be the smartest person in the room to let people let you do this. So let's review. Remember all the money I lost, right? That happened. That wasn't great. But we learned from it. We were able to operationalize a lot of these different processes. So number 1, defining your team's optimization goal. Right? We talked about if it's one team doing all the testing and doing as much as possible, if it's a decentralized effort to sort of change the mindset of how all of the teams test. Coupling your technology and your processes. As you have one team start to own testing, have that team also teach other teams how to use the tools they're building and make sure they fit within your processes. Mandate a measurable hypothesis, right? This is the MVMERC. Don't test things that are wasteful, because at scale that could make a big difference, absolute numbers-wise, that you might not notice right away relatively. Be hyper-analytical. Have your platform tell you everything it needs so you don't regret not having that data once a test is done. And then empower and trust your center of excellence, right? All your processes should empower one team to own these tools, and then have that team be really smart and let everyone know how to use these tools. Where do we end? You're going to be fine. Right? If we're digital experience optimizers, we've got to make fact-based decisions. We've got to do everything better. We've got to run our companies better and more profitably. And you're the one in this room that's in charge of this. You're picking the tools. You're teaching people. You know why it matters. You've got a job that can cause things to go really, really well or really, really poorly because a lot is on the line. So take a deep breath. Make good decisions. Stick with them. Defend them. And everything is going to be swell. Thank you. That's me. I'll put that back up in a sec. As I mentioned, I work at Vivid Seats. I run a podcast platform for some reason called Shortwave. I also run a podcast news board called Podcast Campfire. And if you want more help with this, if you want people to teach how to do that, contact me at Martini Limited. Okay, thanks again.
Thank you very much, Bill. Your point about every technical change is a political change, I think really resonated with me and a lot of people in this room. So we have a few minutes left remaining in the session. I'd like to open the room up to any questions for Bill.
Yo.
Thanks, Bill. That was great.
Oh, thanks. Is that your question?
The attributes, the custom attributes,
Yeah.
how are you sending them? Are you using other tools?
Absolutely.
Maybe
So,
I missed
right,
that.
if you're using, people using Optimizely Web, less than full stack, that's a lot of stuff you get for free, right? So you kind of have the cheat sheet of things that you should put into this. We parse the user agent both on the front end and on the back end. So we're using both JavaScript and Java integrations. And we cookie all that information to send not only to Optimizely, but to New Relic and to GA. And so we manually parse the user agent information We have a library that we use to sort of figure out what that is. And then we just wire it into our internal call to Optimizely full stacks get variation or track event. We have this idea that there are always going to be things that we want to send with every event, which is, again, user agent and page timings. And then if we happen to have individual things like somebody clicked on a filter, we'll also get those for free. That answer the question?
Do you use Optimizely API, or do you?
So we use essentially our own internal API that then uses Optimizely's full stack SDK.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So you don't like use other tools, like you send them to Segment or Adobe, and then from there.
No.
Oh.
We send them, yeah, correct. When we have one event, we send it to a lot of places, right? It's the idea of hyper-analysis that we'll then have that information later if we need it, and not regret not having it if we don't.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Bill, so I was wondering, how did you go from having a small team to having 7, 8 people, and how did you scale up? Did you go externally? Did you hire third-party companies, consultants to help you? And how did you get the buy-in to show that you needed that team?
Yeah, that's a really good question because it took some time. And so at Orbitz, we happened to, I think, get lucky with a couple of tests that were really impactful, the first few ones we run. So we were able to, by being hyper-analytical, attach real dollar values to those first couple tests. And so we got buy-in because we saw that this was a big opportunity to make bigger differences with smaller features. We were sort of in a time there where a lot of our work was very large product rollouts, and we were moving to this mindset of trying to do things more iteratively, more quickly. We were at that same time moving from, I think, 2-week releases to daily. So this was sort of across the board something that the organization, both on the engineering side and on the product side, were focusing on, and this happened to be a really great way to move into that. Now, you asked about staffing as well. We didn't use anyone external. For a while, it was actually me doing all of the engineering, and we happened to have a pretty strong UX team at the time, so we pulled somebody off of that. We had a good data analytics team as well, and then we took a lot of time to hire up the right engineers because this is sort of right. It's a hard job description to find. And so we internally, as we saw people really gravitate towards this from individual product teams, we kind of poached them. And we found people that were really way bought into this, and we moved them into sort of the team that owned it. Yeah.
Hi, thanks, Bill.
Yeah.
What does a roadmap based on learning look like? Can you give some examples?
Sure. Right. So your business teams, your marketing teams, the people who don't write code, have ideas for what they want the organization to do on 6, 12, 18-month timeline. And that's crazy nonsense, right? That's a huge amount of time to pretend like you're going to know what change is going to come. So at least for us, it means whether or not you have an idea of what tests you're going to run a sprint, 2 sprints from now, you have time, you have resources built in to say, we're going to do something with the results of a test we're running right now. And we assume that whatever happens here, if it succeeds, we're going to roll it out, and then we're going to try to beat it, right? We're going to take that next step of how do we improve this even more. If it's a test that uniformly tanks, we're going to turn it off. We're going to try something radically different. If it's a test that, as so often happens, is just sort of middling, we're going to try to improve that. But basically having a chunk of time, a chunk of resources that will be spent on what we're doing with the results we will have by then. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool.
I have one more.
I think I saw him first. Sorry. I can answer it after.
Oh, good. Hi.
Brought yours from home?
Yeah. So when you're building out a team and you're trying to prove the value of experimentation and the ROI, especially to executive leadership, have you had scenarios where you would run major tests? Let's say you see a 2% conversion lift. It's great. You release it to 100% of the traffic. And then a couple weeks later, you look at the financials, and independently of the A/B test report or Optimizing, and you see conversion is flat through this whole time before and after. And if you've had this scenario, what are common reasons why that might happen?
I don't know if I've had exactly that one. I can speak to when you aren't capitalizing as much as you'd expect off an individual test. And I think that's sort of a fundamental problem in like pre-post analysis to begin with, right? Because there's seasonality. There's, right, for us, if like Beyonce and Jay-Z decide to announce another concert, that's going to impact our business. So I think looking on a long timeline of just your entire conversion rate is really challenging because there's going to be so many things that impact that up and down. It's really right, the A and the B need to be compared against each other. So I don't know if I totally answered that. I don't have a great example of that happening. Our data usually supports that we did the right thing.
All right, and that concludes the first build and deploy track. Let's give it up one more time for Bill Hinderman.
Thank you.
And there will be a 20-minute break. Drinks and snacks are in the expo hall, and the next talk goes on at 11 o'clock.